Welcome back. You're watching The Money Show on ET Now. Now, all of us work hard for the most part of our lives, 30, 40 years. We save up very, very slowly. We invest all of that money. We buy realty. We buy all different kinds of assets. Now, this is for our own consumption. It is for, our beneficiaries, our loved ones, our family members' consumption as well after perhaps we pass away. And that's where it gets very, very important to ensure that your hard-earned wealth goes into the right hands, the hands that you intend to benefit from all of your hard-earned money. So how do you ensure a systematic and smooth transfer of all the lifelong wealth you have created? To talk about this, I have with me Vishal Dhawan, the CEO and founder of Plan Ahead Wealth Advisors. Vishal, thanks so much for joining us on ET Now. So I think one key component of planning ahead, as is the name of your firm, is apart from investing for the long term, etc., but ensuring that those investments also go into the right hands. So what is the best way to ensure smooth transfer of, let's start with financial assets first?
Okay, so there are a few guidelines that we always, share with investors around this. So one is one of the challenges that most of the families face is that, especially when the primary bread earner or the person who looks after finances passes away, there is an inability to understand what exactly was owned, and there is this feeling of kind of incompleteness because you're always not sure about what all you had and what all you didn't, and what was in whose name and where was it invested. So I think the starting point for everyone has to be necessarily to maintain a good inventory of what all is actually owned. And some of these are much more challenging in financial assets by default because one can put away very small amounts of money. And therefore, there is an ability for one to forget very easily. For example, for a lot of people who have worked with more than one organization, every time they move from one organization to another, they would have opened a bank account. They haven't necessarily closed all their bank accounts every time they've moved to another organization. And all of a sudden, you have small balances lying in multiple bank accounts. And what your heirs might know about is maybe the account which you tend to operate the most, or maybe two bank accounts, but they may not be aware of everything that is in there. So very clearly, the starting point needs to be to create an inventory and then to keep that updated on an ongoing basis. So what we found very effective with a lot of people is that whatever methodology they use, they might choose to use software that's available. They might choose to use Excel sheets. There are lots of convenient ways to maintain that inventory, but maintaining that inventory is absolutely critical, number one. Number two is that as much as nominations are very useful, because what ends up happening is that the assets can get transferred to a family member with relative ease, it doesn't really end up solving succession completely, because in most financial products, the person who's the nominee is only a guardian of those assets and not the owner of the assets in the eye of the law. And therefore, it's important to have a will that is available. That will needs to be, as simple or as complex as anyone wants it to be. But effectively, having the will in place ends up solving a lot of problems because it becomes very clear that the asset ownership and the nominations, ideally, if they can be synced with each other and say the same thing, it kind of makes it clear in terms of intent. Last but not the least is the need for the updation of the will to be done on an ongoing basis. And one of the reasons why people tend to leave these things to the end is because they're constantly worried that once they do it, they never want to go back to doing it again. And what we find is that because the nature of your assets will keep changing over a period of time, the need to update this document also is crucial. So we would say that for most people, if they have a good quality will and a inventory in place and nominations which are synced up with the will itself, I think the process of transfer, post death can be relatively easier than otherwise.
Vishal, you said that first up, maintaining an inventory of all assets. What all should this inventory include? Of course, shares, mutual funds, but should it include the credit cards, debit cards, loans that I owe?
Oh, this literally needs to be a sheet where you start to think about everything that you've ever owned in your life, on the financial side, and then start to eliminate if you've closed it out. So, besides the bank accounts, which tend to get a lot of attention, the areas where we find that people aren't absolutely, they don't necessarily remember what they have to do is things like, say, bank deposit lockers, right? Again, you might have multiple bank deposit lockers. That needs to be consistently recorded. If there are any sort of loans, either formal loans or informal loans, those need to get documented. What tends to happen is with formal loans, there will typically be someone who will reach out in case a payment has not been made as well. But with informal loans, if you don't have a structure in place, someone might come someday and say, the person who passed away had taken this amount of money from me and it's due back. And you will never really know whether it was the reality or not because it may never have been mentioned. So the need to mention credit cards, loans, whatever type they are, insurance policies, right? Very important, because what tends to happen is, especially when you're younger, you tend to buy these smaller value insurance policies as a part of your tax saving. And then you end up finding that that gets completely missed out. Similarly, there might be other insurance policies, accident policies. Let's say if the death has happened due to an accident, one could make a claim. So this needs to be very, very comprehensive, literally going by assets, mutual funds, stocks, bonds that you might have bought, if you bought any NCDs. All of this needs to come out in an inventory format. And it's perfectly okay if it's long. In fact, most of the times when it's long, it makes people also aware that they just have too much lying around, split into too many places. And very often it leads to a cleanup by itself, which makes, lives much easier to deal with.
Vishal, you spoke about one more thing, and that is nomination not being enough. Why is that? Because this is something that I guess all of us do. Even when we go around to making a fixed deposit with the bank, we have the nomination form and we just write down somebody's name over there. But why are you saying that that is not enough?
Yes, I think this is one of the areas that gets relatively less attention, and most people believe that a nomination done is a job well done and everything is sorted. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is that the genesis of a nomination process came from the fact that earlier on, financial institutions used to insist on a will kind of document to transfer the asset to the family members itself. And what would happen is, during that period of getting the will, let's say probated, for example, there would be a lot of time that would pass by, and maybe there wasn't enough access to money to go by during that period of time. So what nominations really do is that they transfer the asset to the nominee, who's expected to be a guardian of that money, because typically the nominee will be someone in the family who the bank or the financial institution has transferred those assets to. And that is good enough to ensure that the money has reached the family. Now, whether that person is the rightful heir as per the will or not depends on what the will states. And if a person doesn't have a will at all, which is also very common because a large number of people, pass away without a will, then effectively the succession laws come into play depending on the community to which that individual belonged. And what then happens is that different permutations and combinations would come into play in terms of who is the rightful owner of assets. So the important part around creating the inventory also, which is the step just before this, is to ensure that there is clarity on who all are the owners of the assets. Is there a first holder? Is there a second holder? Who's the nominee? And is it consistent with what the will says? Because sometimes when there is a nomination in one person's name and the will states something else, then again it leads to complication because one is not really sure about the intent of the person who um, passed away. Of course, the will override the nomination. In most of the cases, there might be some exceptions where that does not happen, but in general, one should assume that the will override the nomination, and therefore having that in place, correctly drafted and well updated, is really critical.
All right, understood. Vishal, let's talk about trust as well, because that too is, a process that we've heard quite often, but if we don't really use it much, or we are a little unaware of it. So, how do you compare a trust versus will for transfer of assets?
So, what tends to happen is a will tends to be a much simpler document, whereas trusts normally come into place where one is trying to create certain kinds of milestones, at which point maybe the money needs to get dealt with, or the assets need to get dealt with in a different manner or in a certain manner. So what tends to happen is, let's say if someone wants a child to be taken care of and the child is minor today, what one can do is decide to create a trust in the for the family, wherein there are instructions in the trust deed which explain how the asset should really be used for the benefit of that, say, the minor or the child or the children. And it could be very well documented, saying that this money could be used for, say, education or healthcare, or certain milestones that are important for the family. The advantage of a trust is that it means that you don't have to go through a probate process, which is normally what needs to get done in the case of a will, because a will needs to be certified to be true and genuine, and the last will of the person who's written it out. While a trust, because it's set up during a lifetime, just continues as is without any sort of disruption. So that's why people tend to use these instruments differently. But we need to remember that maintaining a trust is a job in itself, because effectively a trust is like a separate entity which needs to get managed. Tax returns need to get filed. Bank accounts need to get maintained, etc. So what needs to happen is that people need to carefully think through whether they require a trust at all, basis the situation in their lives, or whether they are fine enough just having a will in place without a trust overall. Even for people who have a trust, it's very likely that they will still need a will as well. But what you can do is, if your life is fairly simple, you don't have special need children, for example, or you don't have business wealth, you don't have young children that need to get taken care of through a structure, then I think you could stick to just having a will in place rather than complicating your succession.
Okay, and finally, Vishal, I want to move away and talk about the other side now, and the beneficiaries. In fact, the entire process and of understanding, or rather realizing the need for efficient transfer of wealth has come in only now. For many of us, we probably don't even know all the assets that our fathers, our grandfathers may have owned and left behind for us, and we are probably scrambling through buckets and buckets of papers and files to make sense of all the assets. So if you could share some tips as well for our viewers on how they can find this lost ancestral financial wealth.
So I think there's two elements to this. I think there are clearly phases in this whole process that have taken place. I think for someone who doesn't have a good sense on what the financial inventory was, let's say over the last 15 to 20 years, there are mechanisms in place using PAN numbers and email IDs, through which a lot of this discovery can actually happen. Say, for example, if you have mutual fund investments, and a lot of those have got done in different forms, there is an ability to get a consolidated account statement which uses the email ID used as an identifier to generate a consolidated report showing all the investments where the email ID was registered. Now, what's of course important there is that one needs to have access to that email ID, because otherwise that report will come into the email ID and it won't be accessible at all. So I think an important thing to keep in mind is that the digitization of asset records has meant that your email ID and your mobile phone has become a very, very important part of this whole process. Because if you need to reconstruct what has happened financially in terms of assets, one would actually have to do it using these documents. Similarly, if there are stocks, especially those which are dematted, what will end up happening is that through an NSDL or a CDSL statement, you can actually request for it, and that will list out basis the PAN number, what all is available as assets, and one can then try to trace back and get access to those particular assets. I think in cases where you have none of that information available, it's much, much more difficult, because what you end up very often depending upon then is either dividend checks that come in, or there are there might be a letter that comes to you from the company about some information in the form of a corporate action that they may be taking. And that's when you suddenly discover that there are these assets that are in place which you were not aware of. Now, in those cases, the only way to solve this is to actually go back to the registrar of that company, the R&T agent. Each company tends to work with different R&T agents. In some cases, the companies themselves might handle this. One needs to go back and try to rebuild the records to try to understand what exactly is the kind of paperwork that they may require to be able to transfer these assets. So some of them may come back with wills or succession certificates, all kinds of documents that they would require. And because this is not all standardized, it can be quite time consuming and quite challenging for heirs, especially because in today's world, with families that are dispersed all over and nuclear, what ends up happening is many of these things, which require a lot of patience and a lot of time, one simply may not have the time for. So I think it's just important that if you can avoid that process by converting everything to DMAT, at least you will find a lot of these processes much easier to do.
Well, Vishal, we leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us today on ET Now and helping our viewers, with a guidance and a blueprint of how they should go about creating a proper plan to transfer their wealth systematically. And with that, we'll take a short break, but be right back with our Spend with EMS segment, where we'll help you actually save this time on your next EMI bill. Don't go anywhere.